It was the signal, the exact sequence they had received, the same eerie bioacoustic hum, the wet clicking tones, the garbled harmonics that should not have been able to come from a human throat. Carter felt his blood turn to ice. "Jesus Christ," Halliday whispered, taking a step back. Rhodes' body convulsed again, his neck stretched unnaturally, veins darkening beneath his skin like branching ink. Then something moved beneath the surface, a shifting bulge that slid along his forearm, distorting the muscle and bone as it traveled. Rhodes' eyes snapped open. His pupils had expanded into pitch-black voids. A sharp, wet crack split the air. His jaw unhinged wider than human anatomy should allow, an unnatural opening that stretched beyond the limits of his skin. His chest swelled in irregular pulses, ribs bending outward. A sound like tearing fabric filled the room as his skin split in places, small hairline fractures along his arms and neck, leaking something thick and dark. Ling screamed. Carter scrambled back, dragging her with him. "We need to sedate him. Now!" Halliday bolted toward the med station, fumbling for the emergency injector. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Carter held Rhodes down as best as he could, but the man's movements were erratic, his limbs flailing in unnatural patterns, as if something was learning how to control them. Halliday stabbed the injector into Rhodes's neck. The hiss of the sedative filled the air. Rhodes jerked once, then went completely still. His breathing slowed, his body slackening, but the blackness in his eyes remained. The thick veins along his skin didn't fade. His chest still moved strangely, like something inside him had its own rhythm, its own pulse. Carter forced himself to breathe, his hands shaking as he looked down at the man who had, only moments ago, been his colleague. What the hell is happening to him? Ling backed away, pressing a hand to her mouth. "It's in him." Carter turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Ling swallowed hard, her face pale. "The signal. It wasn't just a message. It was a carrier." She pointed at Rhodes' body. The black veins beneath his skin shifted, as if something inside was moving, spreading. "This isn't an illness," she whispered. "It's infestation." Carter felt an icy dread creep through his chest. They had been so eager to respond to the signal, so desperate to make contact. But something had been waiting, and now it was inside them. Dr. Valerie Ling was missing. One moment she had been in the lab, analyzing the waveform, her fingers trembling over the console as she reran the signal's acoustic dissection. The next, her station was empty, her data pad lying abandoned on the floor, the screen smeared with something dark and slick. Carter stood frozen in the doorway, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting deep shadows across the lab. "She wouldn't have just left," Halliday muttered from behind him. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. Carter stepped forward cautiously. The air felt wrong, charged with something unseen, something pressing against his skin. The walls seemed damp, as if a thin layer of condensation had formed over the metal. And then he saw it. A trail of black mucus smeared across the floor, leading toward the airlock chamber. Carter swallowed the rising bile in his throat. "We need to find her." Halliday nodded, gripping the medical scanner tightly as they followed the slick, unnatural trail. The closer they got, the more Carter could hear it, a sound just beneath the station's mechanical hum. A wet, uneven clicking, interwoven with the same distorted frequencies that had come from Rhodes' throat. The airlock hatch was open just a fraction, the dim emergency lights casting a sickly glow inside. Carter's hands trembled as he reached for the door panel. He took a breath, then pushed it open. Ling was inside, or what was left of her. She was standing, her body contorted in an impossible way, limbs stretched at grotesque angles, her head tilted back so far that her throat bulged obscenely beneath the skin. Her eyes, black voids like Rhodes, stared unseeing at the ceiling. Her mouth was open, a deep, gaping chasm, and something was inside. A writhing, pulsating mass of slick black tendrils stretched from the cavern of her throat, twitching in slow, deliberate movements, as if tasting the air. Carter choked on his own breath. Halliday made a strangled noise and stumbled back. Jesus! Jesus Christ! Ling moved. Not naturally, not humanly. Her limbs jerked, spasmed, as if something inside her was figuring out how to operate the body, how to manipulate bones that no longer fit their purpose. Her chest expanded outward, her ribcage bending unnaturally, her skin stretching. And then she spoke. But it wasn't Ling's voice. It was all of them. A layered, discordant harmony of voices, Rhodes, Carter, Halliday, even Ling's own, merging into a grotesque, wet chorus. Join us. Carter grabbed Halliday's arm, dragging him backward. Get the hell out of here. They stumbled into the corridor, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Carter slapped the emergency lock, sealing the airlock chamber. Halliday was shaking violently, his face ashen. That wasn't her. Carter nodded slowly, swallowing hard. No. Halliday wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. What do? We can't stay here. Carter's mind raced. They had to get to the command module, get a distress call out. The station was compromised. The crew was compromised. A sudden crackling sound filled the air. The communications. Carter's stomach dropped. They turned toward the nearest speaker panel. A familiar voice rasped through the static. Rhodes' voice. But Rhodes was still in the med bay, still restrained. You answered, and now you are ours. The walls shuddered. The lights flickered wildly. A low, rhythmic clicking echoed through the ventilation shafts, not from a speaker, but from something moving inside the station. And Carter finally understood. The transmission had never been a distress call. It had been an egg. Something had traveled through the signal itself, embedded in its frequencies. A parasite that had waited for an open channel, a way in. And now it was inside the station. Inside them. Carter ran. The emergency sirens wailed through the station, their shrill mechanical cries lost beneath the other sound. A deep, wet clicking, growing louder, coming from everywhere at once. The station wasn't stable anymore. The walls groaned as if they were breathing, the metal softening, warping under the weight of something unseen. Halliday was right behind him, gasping for air, his steps faltering. They had sealed off the lower decks, but it didn't matter. The infection had already spread. The station was changing, and Carter could feel it in his bones. Something was watching. They skidded into the command module, the reinforced doors hissing shut behind them. Carter slammed his palm against the console, overriding the lockdown. His fingers were shaking as he keyed in the emergency distress signal, sending it straight to Earth. Do not respond to the transmission. Do not send help. The signal is not a cry for aid. It is a trap. It is a parasite. It infects. It grows. It becomes. Do not listen. Do not listen. Do not... Static. The message cut out. The station lights flickered once, then died. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ragged sound of Halliday's breathing. Then, a whisper, not through the speakers. From inside the room, Carter turned, his stomach dropping into a bottomless pit. Halliday wasn't moving. He stood there, chest rising and falling in uneven, unnatural pulses. His skin looked loose, like something was stretching it from the inside. His fingers twitched, curling inward like claws. His head tilted sharply, and then his mouth opened. Wider and wider and wider. Something inside him was pushing forward, parting his jaw far beyond its limit, wet muscle and black-veined flesh stretching as a shape unfurled from his throat. A limb, slick and glistening, emerged from his gaping maw, twitching like it was tasting the air. Halliday's eyes never blinked. Then he spoke. But it wasn't Halliday's voice anymore. It was all of them. Ling Rhodes, Halliday. The layers of voices merged into something wet and inhuman. A chorus of distorted tones that made Carter's teeth ache. You were warned, but you listened. Halliday took a step forward, his head still tilted at that awful, broken angle, his body folding into itself, more of the thing inside him pushing outward. Carter staggered back, his heart pounding. His vision blurred, nausea rising in his throat. He could hear it now, not just outside, inside him. The clicking, the resonance of the transmission. It was in his bones, burrowing deep into his skull like a splintering echo. They were inside him. Carter stumbled toward the emergency hatch. There was only one way out now. The escape pod. Halliday, or what had been Halliday, lunged, the black-veined limb extending from his throat like an uncoiling appendage. Carter slammed his fist against the emergency release, the pod's doors hissing open. He threw himself inside, barely managing to slap the launch controls as something lashed toward him. A wet, sinewy limb, the last remnant of Halliday's body twisting toward him. The pod ejected. Carter felt the moment the station changed. As he tumbled into the black void, the research station moved, the structure pulsing, shedding its metallic form like a husk. The outer plating rippled, organic and shifting, as if it had always been alive, waiting for enough hosts to complete its metamorphosis. He saw movement behind the thick glass of the observation windows, distorted, stretched shapes pressing against the surface. They weren't human anymore. The station began to pulse, and then the signal changed again. Carter's breath hitched as he stared at his console. A new transmission had begun broadcasting, not from the deep void, from the station itself. The pulse was clearer now, refined, faster, spreading. It had learned. It was calling again. And somewhere, light years away, another world would hear it. Another team of eager scientists would listen. Another Carter would answer, and it would begin again. Carter closed his eyes as the last remnants of the station disappeared into the abyss behind him. drifting, alone, but not empty. He could still hear the clicking, soft beneath his skin, and it was getting louder. The planet was a dead thing, cold, airless, and untouched by time. Its surface stretched in endless shades of gray, jagged rock formations rising like broken teeth under the void of space. We had no business being here, yet here we were, standing on its surface in full EVA suits, staring into the abyss we had uncovered. The Icarus had been dispatched after an anomaly was detected beneath the crust, an unnatural formation buried deep in the planet's mantle. The scans showed a structure, symmetrical, artificial. Not a ruin, not debris, something else. The excavation had been easier than expected. The ground, though ancient, gave way with surprising ease, as if the planet wanted us to dig. After a few hours of drilling, the tunnel was exposed, a perfectly smooth, circular shaft leading straight down into darkness. It was impossibly precise, the stone walls untouched by erosion, as if they had been carved just yesterday. No markings, no signs of tools, just blackness yawning below our feet. Dr. Lane was the first to descend. I followed, with Captain Monroe and the rest of the crew behind us. The air changed as we went deeper. Though the planet's atmosphere was practically non-existent, something about the shaft made it feel heavier. A pressure we couldn't explain. It pressed against the suits, against the skin beneath, as if the walls were closing in the farther we went. And then, after what felt like an eternity, we emerged into the chamber. It was enormous. The walls stretched beyond the range of our helmet lights, their surfaces slick and wet, though our scanners detected no moisture. The stone was dark, not black, but a color that shifted subtly depending on the angle. Deep veins of something translucent pulsed within the walls, moving sluggishly, as if the rock itself was alive. Monroe let out a low whistle. This wasn't built by anything human. Dr. Lane was already stepping forward, her gloved hands tracing the walls with cautious reverence. No erosion, no dust. This place is preserved. Something about that word sent a chill through me. We moved deeper, past the towering walls and into the heart of the structure. That was when we saw them. The murals. They stretched across the chamber's interior, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. Not carvings, but something else. Something embedded within the stone itself. The figures depicted were grotesque, elongated forms, their limbs stretched unnaturally, bodies contorted in ways that made my stomach twist. They weren't being killed, they were being reshaped, changed, a sacrifice, a ritual, or something worse. Dr. Lane ran a scanner over the nearest mural. Organic traces, she murmured. The pigment. This isn't paint. I didn't want to ask what it was. We pressed forward. The chamber opened into an altar, a monolithic structure that rose from the floor, its surface shifting under our lights. It wasn't rock. It wasn't metal. It was something in between, something neither dead nor alive. The thing pulsed, a slow rhythmic undulation, like a dormant heart waiting to beat again. Kowalski hesitated. Captain, I don't like this. Monroe nodded. We get what we need and get the hell out. Dr. Lane, however, was transfixed. She took a step closer, reaching out. Her gloved fingers hovered just above the altar's surface, inches from touching. A sound, wet, clicking. somewhere in the darkness behind us. We froze. My breath hitched. Monroe spun, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. What the hell was that? No one answered. I turned slowly, scanning the edges of the chamber. The darkness beyond our lights felt thicker than before. Something about it had changed, had deepened. The air inside my helmet felt warmer. Another sound, closer. Not one noise, but many. Like something breathing from within the walls. Monroe grabbed my shoulder. "We're leaving. Now." No one argued. As we hurried back toward the tunnel, I cast one last glance at the altar. The pulsing had slowed, as if it had felt us leave, as if it was waiting for something. We climbed back up, out of the chamber, out of the void, back to the Icarus, back to safety, or so we thought. The Icarus had never felt so small. We left the planet behind, the lifeless rock shrinking beneath us as we ascended back into the void. I watched through the viewport as its jagged surface faded into nothingness, swallowed by the endless black. The temple was still down there, waiting, preserved, but we hadn't left it behind, not entirely. Monroe ordered a full decontamination sweep the moment we boarded. Standard protocol after any alien contact. Every suit was sterilized, every sample secured in the ship's quarantine bay. Full-body scans came next. No anomalies, no pathogens, no radiation. We were clean, or so we thought. Patel was the first to show symptoms. At first it was nothing, just a cough, dry and persistent. He waved it off, blaming the ship's recycled air. We all laughed. Then, a few hours later, the fever started. His skin glistened with sweat, his uniform damp despite the ship's temperature controls. By the time we found him in his bunk, his pulse was racing. His pupils had dilated so much, his irises were barely visible. "Patel, you okay?" Monroe crouched beside him, frowning. He looked at us, dazed, confused. "Yeah," he said, voice hoarse. "Just weird dreams." But there was something wrong with his face. The muscles in his jaw twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if something beneath the skin had shifted. Dr. Lane ran a scanner over him. "Vitals are unstable." She glanced at the readings. "Heart rates erratic, body temp rising." Patel coughed again, doubling over. Something wet splattered onto the floor. Not blood, not bile, something thicker. "Med bay, now," Monroe ordered. We got him onto the stretcher and wheeled him down the corridor. As I strapped him onto the examination table, I felt something move beneath my fingers, just under his forearm, beneath the skin. A subtle twitch, a slow, rhythmic pulse. I pulled my hands away, my stomach twisted. Patel moaned, his back arching. His breathing turned ragged, labored. Sweat poured down his temples, soaking his hair. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. Then, suddenly, a sharp crack. We all flinched. Patel gasped, his body going rigid, his left wrist split open along the veins, as if the skin had been peeled from the inside. A jagged, translucent protrusion jutted outward, something hard, glassy, covered in a slick membrane. Blood oozed around it, thick and dark. Lane swore, stepping back. Patel screamed. The sound was raw, primal, but as quickly as it came, it cut off. His breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered. Then, silence. For a moment, none of us moved. Patel sat up. He looked around the room, his expression eerily calm. The thing in his arm remained, jutting from his flesh like an exposed bone. But he didn't seem to notice. His pupils were black, wide. "I feel much better," he said. The words came smoothly, too smoothly, as if his voice had been adjusted to sound reassuring. Monroe took a cautious step forward. "Patel," he smiled, a slow, unnatural expression that never quite reached his eyes. "I was just sick," he continued, "but it's gone now." He reached for the glassy protrusion in his arm and pushed it back inside. The skin reformed around it, swallowing the foreign object. Patel exhaled, relaxed, like nothing had happened. The medbay was silent. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. Something inside him was wrong. Something inside him had changed, and he wasn't the only one. By the next rotation, Kowalski started coughing. I barely slept. None of us did. The air on the Icarus felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. The ship was silent, save for the low hum of the engines and the distant sound of someone breathing in the dark. Patel was walking around as if nothing had happened. That was the worst part. After his episode in the medbay, he had returned to his duties like normal, eating, talking, moving almost the same way he always had. But his motions were just a fraction too smooth, his steps a fraction too measured. His voice was calm, too even, like he was mimicking what a human was supposed to sound like. And his skin. When he thought no one was looking, I saw it shift. It didn't stretch or wrinkle the way normal skin should. It was too fluid, as though something beneath it was subtly rearranging itself. Then Kowalski fell sick. It happened fast. He collapsed outside the engine room, hacking up thick strands of something viscous and clear. We rushed him to the medbay, but by the time we got there, his skin had already started to move. At first, it was just a twitch beneath the surface, a subtle ripple along his arms and neck. Then it flowed, bones stretching, shifting, his jaw elongating for just a moment before snapping back into place. He screamed as something pushed beneath his ribcage, bulging outward like an extra set of bones was trying to force its way free. "Hold him down!" Monroe shouted. We pinned Kowalski to the table, but his body fought against itself. His spine arched, cracking, vertebrae pulsing beneath his skin like they were rearranging themselves. Then suddenly, he went still, panting, trembling. Then he sat up. His body straightened, the shaking stopped, and when he opened his eyes, they were wrong. The pupils had swallowed the irises, the blackness stretching too far. His lips curled into a slow, eerily calm smile. "I feel much better," he whispered. The exact same words Patel had said, the exact same tone. I stepped back, my stomach twisting. It was spreading. Dr. Lane was next. She was in the lab when it happened. Monroe and I heard the crash from down the hall, a metallic clatter followed by a ragged gasp. By the time we reached her, she was gripping the edge of the workstation, her fingers clenched so tightly her nails had split. Her breath came in short, rapid bursts. Then she looked up. Her face was shifting. The skin around her cheeks pulled tight, then rippled, something crawling beneath the surface like a current beneath ice. Her jaw twitched, stretching too far before snapping back. Blood leaked from her nose, but she didn't wipe it away. She just smiled. Her voice caught, her throat convulsed, her vocal cords adjusting to something new. She swallowed, took a deep breath, and spoke again. I feel much better. The same words, the same calmness. I turned to Monroe, my pulse hammering. We have to isolate them. Monroe was breathing hard, her eyes wide, darting between Lane, Kowalski, and Patel. They were all watching us now, not moving, just watching. Then, in unison, they all tilted their heads, the same exact motion, the same angle, like one thing inside many bodies. Monroe grabbed my arm. Run! We locked ourselves in the engine room. Outside, the ship was silent. Not a normal silence, but an unnatural one. The kind of silence that felt intentional. I checked the monitors. Patel, Kowalski, and Lane stood in the corridor outside. They weren't knocking, weren't trying to get in, just standing there, waiting. I watched the feed, breath shallow. The longer I stared, the more I noticed it. Small movements, almost imperceptible. Their skin barely shifting, their fingers twitching just a little too fast, their chests rising and falling, but not in time with each other, each breath at a different rhythm, like they were adjusting, learning. Monroe ran a shaking hand through her hair. They're not them anymore, I swallowed. Then what are they? Monroe didn't answer. We weren't alone on this ship. Not anymore. The ship was dead. Or maybe it was just dying, the way an animal does when the infection spreads too far, when the body no longer belongs to itself. The Icarus still hummed faintly with life, the engines thrumming through the floor, but the ship felt wrong. The air smelled strange, thick with something organic and sour. The walls creaked, soft noises whispering through the vents, movements that shouldn't have been there. And I was alone. Monroe was gone. I don't know when it happened, only that one moment she was next to me, gripping the pistol so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and the next, she wasn't. No scream, no sound, just gone. I locked myself in the command module, sealing every bulkhead behind me. The emergency lights flickered, bathing the ship in pulses of dull red. I watched the monitors, breath shallow, hands slick with sweat. The corridors were empty. No sign of Patel, or Kowalski, or Lane. No sign of them. The ship was silent again. That wrong kind of silence. Then the screen flickered. The feed from the cargo bay stuttered, glitching for a split second before stabilizing. I leaned closer, heart hammering. There they were. Patel, Kowalski, Lane, and Monroe. She stood with them now. Her uniform was still torn, her face still streaked with sweat and blood. But she was different. Her arms hung too loosely at her sides, her fingers twitching in slow, rhythmic spasms. Her neck tilted at an unnatural angle, like something had pulled her bones apart and put them back together wrong. She turned toward the camera. So did the others, all at once. Their eyes were hollow, black pits, the same wide, unnatural pupils swallowing whatever they once were. Their skin shifted, a ripple beneath the surface, their bodies adjusting, reforming, the way something deep in the ocean moves when light touches it for the first time. Then, in perfect unison, they smiled. The same slow, deliberate expression. The same message. We see you. I shut off the screen. I had one option left. The Icarus had a fail-safe, A decontamination purge, an emergency protocol designed to incinerate organic threats in case of an outbreak. It was meant for bacteria, for viruses. Not this. But whatever had taken my crew wasn't them anymore, and I wasn't going to let it take me. I accessed the ship's command console, fingers flying across the interface. Warnings flashed in angry red letters. Irreversible action. Confirm purge. My hand hovered over the final key. Then I heard it. A sound behind me. A slow, wet shift, like flesh dragging against metal. I turned. Monroe stood in the doorway. The lock. I had locked the doors. I knew I had. But she was here. The light flickered against her face, casting shadows over features that no longer fit together properly. Her body pulsed in slow, unnatural waves, as if her flesh was only pretending to be skin. She took a step forward. I raised the pistol. She didn't stop. Her head tilted just slightly. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered. Her voice was wrong. I gritted my teeth. My finger tightened on the trigger. "I know you feel it," she continued, taking another step closer. "The change inside you." I swallowed. My stomach twisted. My voice faltered. Because I had felt something. Since we left the temple, the headaches, the strange warmth under my skin, the brief, fleeting moments where my vision had blurred, where my fingers had tingled with something I couldn't explain. No, it wasn't true. I was still me. Monroe's smile widened. Her pupils dilated, absorbing more light than they should have been able to. "You don't have to fight it." I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out in the small space, deafening. Monroe staggered back, a hole between her ribs. Blood, or something like it, spilled across the floor. She didn't fall, didn't scream, just looked down at the wound, blinking slowly as if mildly inconvenienced. Then, still smiling, she stepped forward again. I slammed my hand against the console. Purge initiated. The alarm wailed through the ship. Heat rose in a sudden, searing wave. I barely had time to register Monroe's final expression, something between amusement and disappointment, before the flames roared to life. The ship screamed, a high, shrieking wail that wasn't just metal, wasn't just burning systems. It was them. The bodies in the cargo bay convulsed, flesh unraveling in thick, pulsing ribbons. Their limbs stretched too far, bones melted, muscle turned to something soft, shifting, alive in ways it shouldn't have been. They were burning, and they were still trying to change. Monroe reached for me, her fingers elongating in the heat, her body contorting as if she could pull itself back together. Her skin crawled, pieces of her twisting and reshaping, searching for a way to survive. I ran. The fire spread faster than I could move. Bulkheads melted, the air turned thick with the scent of charred flesh, flesh that didn't burn like human bodies should. The Icarus groaned, the walls pulsing as if the ship itself had become something living, something struggling against its own death. I reached the escape pod, slapped the release. The last thing I saw before the hatch slammed shut was Monroe's face, or what used to be Monroe. Her skin was gone, her body stripped to something raw, something unfinished. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, just a wet, gurgling click. Then the fire swallowed her whole. I drifted in silence. The Icarus burned behind me, a dying star against the void. I watched it shrink. The last remnants of my crew, of what they had become, consumed by flame. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. I stared down at my hands. They were trembling. Something moved beneath my skin. Just a flicker, just for a second. I closed my eyes. I hadn't escaped after all. The night smelled of rot. A damp chill clung to the air as Dr. Adrian Cross pulled his coat tighter around his body. The excavation site was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic crunch of shovels piercing damp earth. The only light came from the tall industrial lamps set up around the open grave, their beams slicing through the thickening mist. This wasn't normal. None of it was. Adrian had been summoned here with little explanation, only a single chilling message from his colleague at the Forensic Pathology Department. You need to see this for yourself. He glanced at the coffin, still half buried in the soil. The wooden lid was intact, pristine, as if it had been placed underground only hours ago, not 5 years. He knew that was impossible. Graves decayed, wood warped. But here it was, untouched like the body inside. Adrian had seen his share of anomalies in the field of medical science, but nothing like this. The man buried here, Nathaniel Rourke, had died in a car accident 5 years prior. His body had been embalmed, lowered into the ground, and left to return to dust. Except that hadn't happened. They say the body's whole, muttered one of the workers beside him, his breath visible in the frigid air. The man's hands trembled as he wiped his brow despite the cold. That it looks like he never died. Adrian said nothing, staring at the coffin. He had examined the reports before coming. Official documents, signed and recorded. There had been no mistake. Rourke had been confirmed dead, buried with an official death certificate. Yet now his grave was being unearthed under orders from high-level authorities. Someone knew something, but no one was talking. One of the workers, a burly man with calloused hands, hesitated before pressing a crowbar beneath the coffin lid. He looked at Adrian as if seeking final confirmation. Adrian nodded. The crowbar pried, wood splintering as the lid gave way. Then the stench hit them, thick, acrid, and wrong. It wasn't the expected scent of decomposition. It was sharper, like ammonia, mixed with something biological, something still living. A ripple of unease spread through the workers as they staggered back, covering their noses. Adrian, his instincts warring between scientific curiosity and primal fear, stepped forward. And then it happened. A noise. A wet, gurgling inhale. The corpse in the coffin, Rourke, breathed. Adrian's pulse slammed against his ribs. The air in his lungs turned to ice. For a moment, he thought his mind had betrayed him, conjuring the impossible from exhaustion. But then, Rourke's eyes shot open. It was too fast, too unnatural. No fluttering of eyelids, no slow return to consciousness. One moment he was still, the next his eyes were staring straight up, milky yet alert, their pupils too wide. A strangled cry erupted from one of the workers as he stumbled back, dropping his tools. Adrian barely registered it, unable to tear his gaze away from Rourke. The man, if he could still be called that, sat up in a rigid, unnatural motion, his joints creaking as if unused for centuries. The coffin groaned beneath his shifting weight. His skin was pale but intact, almost waxy, stretched too tightly over his skull. Thick veins, dark like ink, pulsed beneath the surface, writhing like something lived inside them. His lips parted, revealing teeth that were wrong. Some were too sharp, too long, as though new rows had begun to form in places they shouldn't be. Rourke's mouth moved, but no sound came. His jaw shuddered, as if struggling to remember how to function. And then, finally, he spoke. "They're watching." Adrian's stomach clenched. The words came out in a voice that was almost human. Almost, but something in it vibrated, layered, like two voices speaking at once. The workers had already fled, their terrified footsteps fading into the night. Adrian remained rooted in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. Rourke's head tilted slightly. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost insect-like. His gaze met Adrian's, and for the first time, Adrian felt something alien staring back at him. Then Rourke exhaled, a deep, wet sound thick with something viscous. He shifted again, and something inside him cracked, a sickening noise like cartilage bending in ways it shouldn't. Adrian took a step back. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee like the others. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because deep in Rourke's gaze, beneath the growing horror, Adrian saw something else. Recognition. Rourke knew him. And that terrified him more than anything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow over the sterile walls of the containment facility. The air was cold, artificially so, the kind of controlled temperature meant to slow decomposition, to preserve biological samples for study. But the thing inside the observation cell wasn't decomposing. It wasn't changing the way it should. Dr. Adrian Cross stood behind the reinforced glass, his hands gripping the metal railing in front of him. On the other side of the glass, Nathaniel Rourke sat in a steel chair, motionless. The room was bare, no furniture except for the chair, no objects he could use to harm himself or others. But Rourke made no move to escape. He didn't even blink. Adrian had been staring at him for the past 3 hours, waiting for signs of distress, confusion, anything human. But Rourke remained still, his hands resting on his knees, his posture unnervingly perfect. "You should talk to him," came a voice behind him. Adrian turned to see Dr. Helena Watts, a forensic pathologist and one of the only other people authorized to be here. Her expression was tense, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "He talks to me," Adrian muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena's brow furrowed. "And?" Adrian swallowed. "And I don't think we want to hear what he has to say." Helena gave him a sharp look before stepping past him to the intercom. With a press of a button, her voice filtered into the observation cell. "Nathaniel Rourke," she said, "do you know where you are?" For a long moment there was no response. Rourke's body remained perfectly still, his chest rising and falling at irregular intervals, like a man forcing himself to breathe. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the glass. His pupils were dilated, nearly swallowing the whites of his eyes. "This place is irrelevant," he said. Adrian stiffened. The voice still carried that strange, layered quality, like two voices speaking just out of sync with each other. "Do you remember your accident?" Helena pressed. "Do you remember dying?" Rourke blinked. The first blink in hours. His lips parted slightly, and for a moment, Adrian thought he saw something move inside his mouth. Something wet. Something else. "I was chosen," Rourke said. His voice was flat, empty. "Not just me. Others." Helena shot Adrian a glance. "Chosen for what?" Rourke's fingers twitched. The first real movement of his hands since he had been brought in. His fingernails had darkened since last night, thickening, the edges growing jagged as if they were no longer made of keratin, but something harder. "To be the first," Rourke said. A chill slithered down Adrian's spine. Helena cleared her throat, steadying her voice. "The first of what?" Rourke's lips stretched, and for one horrifying second, Adrian thought he was smiling. But no, his skin was too tight, his muscles too rigid. The expression was wrong, like something wearing human flesh, trying to mimic the way people moved. "To be what comes after you," Rourke whispered. Adrian's fingers dug into the railing. Rourke leaned forward slightly, his head tilting, his gaze locking onto Adrian's as if he could see him through the mirrored glass. His pupils flickered, shifting in a way that wasn't human, wasn't natural. "They chose this world long ago," Rourke continued, "to watch, to see if you would be worth saving." Adrian's throat was dry. "Who are they?" Rourke's lips trembled, and this time Adrian was certain something moved beneath his skin, something shifting just beneath the surface. "The ones who came before," Rourke whispered. "The ones who seed, the ones who harvest." Helena turned off the intercom. "I don't like this," she muttered. "He's playing games." But Adrian wasn't sure. Rourke wasn't just saying these things. He believed them. Number worse than that, he knew them to be true. Adrian stepped closer to the glass, peering at the subtle shifts in Rourke's skin. His veins pulsed darkly, thicker than before. His jaw twitched, and for a moment, Adrian could have sworn he saw something flex in the back of his throat. Something wet, something alive. "I want a full genetic breakdown," Adrian murmured, still watching Rourke carefully. "Whatever is happening to his body, we need to know how far it's gone." Helena hesitated. "What if we don't like the answer?" Adrian didn't look at her. He was too focused on Rourke, who was still watching him with that cold, unblinking stare. "Then we'll finally know what we're dealing with," Adrian said. But deep down, he already had a feeling. This wasn't just a mutation, it was an evolution, and humanity had never been part of the plan. The change began on the third day. Dr. Adrian Cross stood outside the reinforced glass of the containment cell, his breath coming in shallow pulls, his fingers clenched into fists as he watched Nathaniel Rourke, or what was left of him, sitting eerily still in the center of the room. At first, the changes had been subtle. His skin had lost its human elasticity, taking on a strange, almost translucent quality. The veins beneath had darkened, thickened, pulsing irregularly as if something moved through them that wasn't blood. His fingernails had lengthened into sharp, jagged points, flaking at the edges as if something stronger was forcing its way through the brittle remains of human tissue. And then, yesterday, the real transformation had started. Adrian had been reviewing the medical scans when the first signs of internal changes appeared. Rourke's ribcage had expanded unnaturally, not through swelling, but through structural shifting. The bones themselves were growing, realigning into something that should not be possible within the confines of human anatomy. His lungs had started producing a second resonance, a low-frequency vibration that, when analyzed, had no organic explanation. And now he was watching. Rourke's head tilted slowly, his jaw tightening in controlled, deliberate movements. His lips had cracked from the strain of something beneath them, stretching the skin, trying to make room. The small camera inside the room buzzed with static interference whenever he moved too quickly, like the very air around him was wrong. Adrian forced himself to step closer to the glass. His mind told him this was still a man, still something rational and comprehensible, but every instinct in his body screamed otherwise. Rourke's eyes snapped toward him with unnatural precision. "Do you know what happens when flesh is rewritten?" Rourke asked suddenly. The voice, the voice had changed. Gone was the strange layering from before. Now it was deeper, almost wet, like something thick sloshed behind his throat as he spoke. Adrian reached for the intercom, ignoring the cold sweat prickling his skin. "What's happening to you?" Rourke's lips twitched. The gift of adaptation, the next step. You were never meant to remain in your current form forever, but you resisted. His fingers twitched against his knees, the movements spasmodic, like nerves firing without control. Then the skin on his hand split. It wasn't a wound. Not exactly. The flesh peeled, opening as if his body had decided it no longer needed such limitations. The exposed tissue beneath was dark, slick with something that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. But it was moving, not like muscles shifting beneath the skin, but like something else inside him was stirring. Adrian's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay composed. Rourke lifted his hand, examining it with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. The torn skin didn't bleed. It quivered as if struggling to decide whether it should close again or stay open. "This is the hunger," Rourke murmured. "The need to shed what is insufficient." His gaze locked onto Adrian's again, and the doctor felt himself being measured. "You're afraid," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. Adrian swallowed hard. "Shouldn't I be?" Rourke let out a slow, guttural exhale. The sound made the speakers crackle. "Fear is irrelevant. It only delays the inevitable." And then he stood. Adrian took an involuntary step back, instinct overriding logic. Something had happened overnight. Rourke had grown taller, not dramatically, but enough that it was noticeable. His shoulders were broader, his limbs slightly too long, his posture too fluid. His clothing, the simple gray uniform they had issued him upon intake, was straining against his frame. And the worst part, he was still changing. Helena's voice crackled over the radio from the control booth. "Adrian, we need to talk. Now." He turned, heart hammering. "What is it?" Her voice was tight, controlled, but laced with something he hadn't heard in her before. Genuine fear. "I ran a new analysis on his blood," she said. "The cell structures aren't just mutating, they're replacing themselves." Adrian's grip on the intercom tightened. "Replacing?" She hesitated. "He isn't human anymore. Not really." The words settled like lead in his chest. He turned back to Rourke, but Rourke was no longer looking at him. His head was tilted upward slightly, his mouth parting just enough to expose his teeth. And God, they were longer. Not just sharper, there were more of them now. Helena's voice came again, quieter this time. "There's something else." Adrian braced himself. "Tell me." We compared his samples from 2 days ago with the ones from today. She paused. "The results don't match, like they came from 2 entirely different organisms." Adrian exhaled sharply. "You're saying he's not just changing, he's becoming something else." A sharp, high-pitched screech suddenly rang through the speakers, making both of them recoil. The static was deafening for a second, the feedback nearly unbearable. Adrian snapped his gaze to Rourke, only to find Rourke staring directly at the camera. He hadn't moved, hadn't done anything. But the moment he had turned his attention to the camera, the interference had begun. Then, slowly, agonizingly, Rourke's lips curled into a smile, and every light in the facility flickered. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. The experiment was failing. It was succeeding, but not in the way they had hoped. The alarms screamed through the facility. Red warning lights pulsed along the corridors, casting everything in a sickly crimson glow. The reinforced glass of the containment cell was cracked from the inside, splintering in a pattern that looked less like an impact and more like something had pushed its way through at an atomic level. Nathaniel Rourke was no longer inside. Adrian ran. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he sprinted through the maze of sterile white hallways, now streaked with dark smears. Blood, but not just human. Something else had mixed with it, something viscous and wrong, congealing against the walls like it was trying to grow. The radio in his hand crackled with static. He pressed it against his lips, voice hoarse. "Helena, do you copy? Where are you?" A burst of interference, then a voice, weak, broken by the distortion. "The surface. Adrian, get to the surface." A wet, gurgling screech echoed through the corridor behind him. Not human, not even close. Adrian bolted. He rounded a corner just in time to see what had once been a security officer collapse against the wall, his body convulsing violently. His face, or what remained of it, was distorting, stretching as if something beneath the skin was fighting to emerge. His fingers twitched, bones splintering as they lengthened into something insectile. The officer turned his head, eyes now black pools devoid of recognition. Then his jaw unhinged. Adrian didn't stay to see what came next. He burst through the final set of doors leading to the surface access tunnel, slamming the emergency override panel. The facility locks hissed as they disengaged, the heavy blast doors rolling open with agonizing slowness. The moment there was enough space, he squeezed through, lungs burning as he pulled himself up the cold metal rungs of the emergency ladder. Above him, the final hatch stood between him and open air. Then he heard it, a whisper seeping through the vents. Not one voice, many. A chorus of something beyond comprehension, layered and infinite, pressing against the edges of his mind. They are here. His muscles locked, his breathing turned shallow, his vision blurred at the edges, reality folding in on itself. It wasn't just sound, it was inside him. With a strangled cry, Adrian forced himself upward, throwing his shoulder into the hatch. The metal groaned before giving way, and suddenly he was outside, out of the nightmare, out of the suffocating tunnels, and into something much worse. The sky was wrong. The stars were gone. In their place was movement, vast shifting shadows that coiled and undulated against the void, obscuring the heavens like a curtain of living darkness. The very air vibrated with a frequency his body wasn't meant to comprehend, a low, endless hum that turned his stomach to liquid. Helena was there, leaning against the rusted remnants of a communications tower. Her lab coat was torn, her hair matted with sweat and blood. She turned at the sound of his arrival, her face pale and streaked with horror. "They're awake," she whispered. Adrian staggered toward her. "We have to." A sound cut him off, a deep, resonant chime that echoed across the barren landscape. It was not made by any human instrument. It was a signal. Helena flinched. "They've been waiting for this." Adrian's mind raced. He thought of Rourke, of the experiment. The seed had been planted long ago, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And now it had. The ground beneath them rumbled, not from an earthquake, but from something stirring beneath the Earth's surface. The facility was shaking itself apart, fissures opening in the terrain, spilling forth something dark, viscous, alive. Adrian turned to Helena, but her eyes had gone wide, fixed on something behind him. Dread curdled in his gut. He turned. Rourke stood at the top of the access hatch, his figure silhouetted against the pulsing void above. Or rather, what had once been Rourke. He had outgrown his human frame. His torso had split along the sternum, opening like a wet chrysalis to reveal a form that defied biology. His arms had lengthened, each joint articulated with too many bends. His mouth, or what was left of it, hung in a grotesque approximation of speech. But the words that came from him did not belong to him. "The experiment is complete," Rourke said, his voice not his own. Something vast shifted above them, the sky itself breathing. Helena clutched Adrian's wrist. "We have to run." But where? There was no place left to run. Adrian took a step backward as Rourke advanced. His body moved with unnatural grace, his flesh glistening with something that pulsed like wet muscle. His fingers twitched, and Adrian felt something inside his head shift, like an invisible hand reaching through his skull, pressing against his thoughts. "This is the end." Rourke's head tilted. "No," he murmured. "This is the beginning." The sky tore open, not with light, not with fire, but with absence. A void that was not simply darkness, but a hunger so vast, so consuming, that it swallowed the very concept of existence. The last thing Adrian saw before the world collapsed inward was Rourke's face, stretching, splitting, peeling apart to reveal something beneath, something endless. And then, nothing.